Chapter 3, Zeptoformic Evolution, Section 1, Outline. As discussed in the introduction of this video series, this is the three-dimensional structure of the zeptoform. As already discussed, the Zeptoform theory has been developed, in part, based on the Enneagram theory. The 9 points of the Enneagram correspond to the 9 points of the Zeptoform. According to the Enneagram theory, the process from point 9 to point 6 to point 3 and to point 9 is considered to be one set of disintegration processes. When these processes are reversed, we can get integration processes. Related to these integration processes, Nikola Tesla said the following:
"If you only knew the magnificence of 3, 6, and 9, then you would have a key to the universe."
In the process of integration, point 3 merges into point 1. Then, it goes up to the supreme vertex as illustrated. Details are discussed in Chapter 1. As discussed in Chapter 1, the processes on the left figure are the processes of developing personality as a social mask. On the other hand, the processes on the right figure are the processes of transforming the personality into the essential personality. The analysis of the developmental process of personality, as well as essential personality, can be applied to the analysis of the developmental process of worldviews. That is the main topic of this video. Chapter 3, Section 2, Worldviews. In this figure, we can see the developmental levels of worldviews. From the bottom, there is archaic, tribal, rebellious, traditional, modern, postmodern, metamodern, and transcendent. In the process from archaic to modern, personality as a social mask develops. This is the process from point 8 to point 9 to point 6 and to point 3. Then, in the process from modern to the level of transcendent, personality is transformed into transpersonality, which is also called the essential personality. This is the process from point 3 to point 6, to point 9 to point 3, and to another point 3. The developmental process of worldviews is related to the process from the self-preservation instinct to the sexual instinct and to the social instinct. The archaic level, which is the earliest developmental stage of society, is represented by the combination of point 8 and point 9. Point 8 represents the self-preservation instinct, which is also called the survival instinct. It includes the combative instinct. That is the fundamental ground of our life. Then, point 9, as the seed, or an infant, located on the ground. Frederick Laloux, who is the author of Reinventing Organizations, described the characteristic of this stage in the following way:
"The ego is not fully formed. People don't perceive themselves as entirely distinct from others, or from the environment, which causes some to romanticize about this period, seeing it as pre-dualism bliss, ignoring the extremely high rate of violence and murder at this stage."
As we can see, the characteristics of this stage can be seen as the mixture of the aggressiveness of point 8 and the symbiotic intimacy of point 9. In the process from archaic to tribal, type 9 dissociates from the quality of type 8 and associates with the quality of type 2. This is the process from the self-preservation instinct to the sexual instinct. That is, the sexual instinct is especially represented by type 2. The tribal level is also called the magical level. That is characterized by magical thinking, and that is represented by the characteristics of type 9. Riso and Hudson said,
"Type 9 tends to wait for magical solutions. 9s often expresses idealized, archetypal worlds, usually the real world fictionalized into something fantastic and wondrous. 9s are often gifted storytellers."
In terms of colors, archaic and tribal are represented by infrared and red, respectively. These are the colors of the survival instinct. However, the red level is covered up by magenta, which represents the sexual instinct. The reason for this color replacement can be explained in the following way. Magenta represents the quality of a mother. Then, the baby tends to assimilate into the quality of a mother, or magenta, by using the function of empathy. This is one of the reasons why magenta is located at an earlier stage of human development. Then, in order for the baby to keep the experience of magenta, she needs to cover up the quality of red. The reason can be explained in the following way. As illustrated in this figure, the essence of type 2, which represents the love of a mother, brings about the experience of merging. Conversely, the essence of type 8, which represents the strength of the beast, brings about the experience of separation. This separation is also called differentiation or discrimination. Alma says,
As a child begins to differentiate herself from her mother in infancy, she must learn to discriminate before she can separate. The ability to say, that is my mother, and this is me, is an expression of the capacity of discrimination. In order to separate, we need strength, we need to feel strong enough to be able to stand on our own. If I don't feel strong enough to stand on my own feet, I won't want to feel separate. I will want to remain connected in order to get support and nourishment.
as described by Almas, strength, which is the essence of type 8, brings about the separation from one's mother, and that is the separation of magenta. Therefore, the baby, who wants to keep the quality of magenta, tends to cover up the quality of red by the quality of magenta. As we can see, type 9 has the tendency to assimilate into the quality of type 2. Related to this, the relationship between type 9 and type 2 is described by Riso and Hudson in the following way.
There are a number of similarities between these types. It is usually average 9s who mistakenly think that they are 2s. 9s, particularly women, would like to be 2s because they believe that 2 is the loving type, and since these 9s also see themselves as loving, they feel that they must therefore be 2s.
As we can see, type 9 has the tendency to assimilate into the maternal figure of type 2. Point 9 is called the seminal point. Seminal is related to seed and semen, implying the essential influence on later development. Point 9, as a seed, is located above point 8. Point 8 represents the fundamental ground of our physical life, which is the survival instinct. Then, point 9, as a seed, or an infant, on the ground, is nurtured by the mother quality of point 2. This is the process from point 9 to point 7, supported by the nurturing function of point 2. The infant, which is point 9, is brought up to a boy, which is point 7. In this process, type 9 assimilates into the mother-like quality of type 2 by imitating it. By doing so, he or she covers up the beast-like quality of type 8, as illustrated. In this state, type 9 lacks the action power of type 8. This is called the state of lazy sleeping. When the sleeping mode of point 9 is very deep, type 9 also loses the action power of point 7, as illustrated. The process from tribal to rebellious is represented by the process from type 9 to type 6. In this process, the aggressiveness of point 8 re-emerges. That is, on the rebellious level, type 6 is connected to type 8, as illustrated. On the rebellious level, type 8 is illustrated as the red-orange beast, that is different from the red beast on the archaic level. The red beast represents self-preservation type 8, and the red-orange beast represents sexual type 8. The latter, which is the sexual 8, can be seen as a derived type, derived from the self-preservation 8. Related to this, the sexual instinct develops based on the self-preservation instinct. The aggressiveness of type 8 is emphasized in this subtype. That is, sexual type 8 is more rebellious than self-preservation type 8. In today's society, the rebellious level is represented by mafias and street gangs. As already discussed, the process from tribal to rebellious is represented by the process from type 9 to type 6. With that said, according to the Enneagram theory, in the process from type 9 to type 6, type 9 becomes passive-aggressive like unhealthy type 6. In this figure, the process from point 9 to point 6 correlates with the process from point 2 to point 8. According to the Enneagram theory, in the process from type 2 to type 8, type 2 becomes aggressive like type 8. The process from rebellious to traditional is represented by the process from sexual type 6 to social type 6. Sexual type 6 is defiant, which is counterphobic. But social type 6 is loyal, being obedient to authority. The traditional level is divided into two stages, as illustrated. The first stage, which is connected to the quality of type 2, is the transitional state from the sexual instinct to the social instinct. Then, the second stage, which is connected to the quality of type 1, represents the social instinct. This social aspect of type 6 is described by Chestnut in the following way.
Social sixes can have many characteristics in common with type 1s. Like 1s, they follow rules and tend to be controlled, critical, hardworking, punctual, precise, and responsible.
As we have discussed, the process from rebellious to traditional is the process from the sexual instinct to the social instinct. In this process, the aggressiveness of type 8 tends to be suppressed. That is, the social level is not represented by type 8. Therefore, social type 8 is called the countertype of type 8. It means that social type 8 does not look like type 8. That is described by Chestnut in the following way.
Social 8s represent a contradiction. The 8 archetype rebels against social norms, but the social 8 is more loyal, less aggressive. This 8 often doesn't look like an 8.
However, social 8s are not always the opposite of antisocial. They might create antisocial social groups, such as mafias. As already discussed, in the process from rebellious to traditional, type 6 is connected to the characteristics of type 1. Type 1 is the most moralistic type among all enneatypes. This tendency is especially represented by social ones. Riso and Hudson said,
Social ones devote their time and energy to bringing people's attention to social ills. Social ones feel that personal needs can be addressed only after more pressing social problems have been faced.
As we can see, social ones represent the archetype of moralistic type 1. The process from traditional to modern is represented by the process from social type 6 to social type 3. The modern level is also called the rational level, and that is characterized by pragmatic thinking and personal achievement. Related to this, type 3 is called the achiever. The rational worldview of the achiever tends to value higher education, entrepreneurship, and meritocracy. These are the characteristics of type 3, and they are related to business as well as science. Type 3 has a tendency to assimilate into the authoritative father figure of type 1. But there is a problem with the authenticity of type 3. That will be discussed in conjunction with the difference between type 1 and type 3. Type 1 tends to be authoritative and wants to be authentic. On the other hand, type 3 tends to be decorative, meritocratic, and pragmatic. Riso and Hudson describe the similarities and differences between type 1 and type 3 in the following way.
Average 1s and average 3s are sometimes mistaken because both types are efficient and highly organized. Both are highly task-oriented and tend to put their feelings on the back burner to get things done. Both share a desire to improve themselves and to meet high standards, although the basis of their standards and their key motivations are quite different. 1s are inner motivated by strong consciences. Average 3s, by contrast, are efficient pragmatists, primarily interested in success and prestige, trying to excel to overcome feelings of family shame.
1s strive for moral perfection in society, but 3s strive for the perfection of their own self-image in order to get social status and recognition. That is, while 1s want to be perfect, 3s want to be seen as perfect. Unlike type 1, type 3 is intrinsically connected to the characteristics of type 7, which represents freedom or liberty. Type 3 and type 7 are both energetic and flexible for making plans and putting them into action. Type 3 and type 8 are both ambitious and competitive. Type 3 is also connected to the characteristics of point 5, which represents science. However, when the scientific viewpoint of point 5 is used by the pragmatic motivation of type 3, problematic tendencies tend to arise. Related to this, the difference between Type 3 and Type 5 is described by Riso and Hudson in the following way.
The principal reason these two very different types are confused is that some average 3s, especially if they are intelligent, would like to see themselves as thinkers. Since 5s are most stereotypically seen as the intelligent, thinking type, average 3s may choose Type 5 rather than the type they actually are. There are many significant dissimilarities between these two types. 5s are just as likely never to seek fame or fortune for their discoveries or creations. 3s, by contrast, are not usually involved in subjects for their own sake. They may change their interests and careers rapidly, if the success and recognition they seek elude them. Moreover, average 3s pursue their intellectual work with personal goals in mind, to impress others, to be famous, to be acclaimed as a genius, to beat a rival at a discovery, to win a prestigious prize or grant, and so forth.
As we can see, the intellectual insight of Type 3 is related to meritocracy and pragmatism. The social 3 is the most typical 3, and he represents a social mask. Chestnut said,
This 3 is in many ways the most obvious 3. Type 3s are the prototype for the way in which we all adopt a personality as an external public face, in order to survive in the world, and mediate between the inner self and the social environment. It is the model for the desire we all have to put on a good face, or wear a social mask.
Riso and Hudson said,
Social 3s need recognition and reassurance that they are making progress, moving up in the world. Degrees, job descriptions, good grades, and awards are important to them because they are strongly identified with their social roles. They can become highly driven in their social ambitions, constantly networking, giving out cards, and making connections.
Type 3 is called the achiever. In order to achieve something pragmatically, Type 3 tends to dissociate from their feeling functions and tends to wear a golden mask. According to Riso and Hudson, that is called the functioning mode. The process from modern to postmodern is represented by the process from point 3 to point 6 and to point 9. There is a transitional stage between modern and postmodern, as illustrated. At the transitional stage, people begin to realize the problematic aspects of the modern stage, such as the destruction of the natural environment. Point 6, as a transitional stage, brings about the transition from the pragmatic mode of point 3 to the empathic mode of point 9. In this process, people try to regain empathetic harmony in the world. It can be seen as a returning process from the sphere of technology to that of nature. As we have seen, the process from modern to postmodern is represented by the process from point 3 to point 6 and to point 9.
The 3 tiers.
Major periods of history, in terms of the developmental process, are divided into 3 tiers as illustrated. The first tier includes archaic, tribal, rebellious, traditional, modern, and postmodern. In the modern West, 60% of the population are located at the levels from archaic to traditional. The modern level is 40 to 50%. The postmodern level is 20%. The percentages do not add up to 100 because they overlap. The postmodern level is the leading edge of cultural evolution at the present moment. The shift, from postmodern to metamodern, is the shift from first tier to second tier. In this shift, we will experience the major development of our societies. The metamodern level is 5%, and it will reach 10% within the decade. Ken Wilber said,
This 10% turns out to be an important tipping point during human history, whenever the leading edge of evolution and development becomes around 10% of the population. Major, profound, and extensive changes occur throughout the overall population, as these newly emergent values begin to populate and saturate the culture, even though only 10% of the population is actually at this leading edge stage.
On the metamodern level, all preceding worldviews are integrated into one unified perspective. This integration is accomplished by the cognitive abilities of visionary mind. The third tier, which is the transcendent level, will be discussed in Section 9. In the process from postmodern to metamodern and to transcendent, All preceding worldviews are integrated into one unified perspective. Chapter 3, Section 3, Centricity and Morality, Part 1. In the previous section, we discussed the developmental levels of Line A, that is the developmental levels of worldviews. Then, in this section, we will discuss the levels of Line B and those of Line C. These are the developmental levels of centricity and morality. Centricity is a range of central importance. This definition is used in the Zeptoform Theory. Then, the expansion of centricity can be seen in the following way. The process from pre-egocentric to egocentric is the process from pre-egoic to egoic. In this process, the sense of I is created. That is a sense of boundary between me and others. Then, in the process from egocentric to ethnocentric, to world-centric, to meta-world-centric, and to trans-centric, the centricity expands, and eventually, we can transcend centricity. In these processes, the egoic self is transformed into the transpersonal self. A baby is born at the pre-egocentric level. The transition from pre-egocentric to egocentric is around ages from 2 to 6. In this process, the boundary between ego and others is created. Then, the ethnocentric level emerges from ages 6 to 11. Many people remain at one of those levels. According to the research by Robert Keegan of the Harvard Graduate School, 60% of Americans remain at ethnocentric or lower levels. In terms of the expansion of centricity, the three instincts can be seen in the following way. In the process from the self-preservation instinct to the sexual instinct and to the social instinct, the centricity expands from the consideration of your survival to the consideration of your partner, to the consideration of your family, and to that of your society.
Note:
The three instincts can be seen in two different ways. One is 3 developmental levels, and the other is 3 different developmental lines. When the 3 instincts are seen as 3 developmental lines, the centricity of each instinct can expand independently. For example, the self-preservation type at the archaic level and that of the postmodern level tend to use their self-preservation instinct in different ways. At the archaic level, a person tends to care about the survival of only oneself. On the other hand, at the postmodern level, a person can have the world-centric perspective, and thus, he or she can care for the survival of all people in the world. As we can see, although the 3 instincts are related to developmental levels, one's developmental level cannot be determined by his or her instinctual subtype. That is, among the 3 instinctual subtypes, there is no superiority nor inferiority. Tribalism, nationalism, and globalism are also related to centricity. Tribalism is the lifestyle of tribes. In today's society, tribalism can also mean discriminatory attitudes towards other tribes or other groups. Nationalism emerges from the ethnocentric level, and that is related to patriotism and fascism. Globalism, which emerges from the world-centric level, is divided into 2 stages, the modern stage and the postmodern stage. The former, which is the modern stage, is related to capitalism, and the latter, which is the postmodern stage, is related to environmentalism, as well as care for immigrants. The integration of these 3 levels emerges from meta-world-centric level. This integration will be discussed later. Levels of centricity and those of morality are intrinsically related. On lower levels of centricity, people are narrow-minded and tend to be egoistic and egotistic. But, as their levels go up, their moralistic perspectives become more and more inclusive and less egoic. Lawrence Kohlberg defined the 3 developmental levels of morality. These are called pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. According to Kohlberg, each of the 3 levels of morality can be divided into 2 stages, and thus there are 6 stages, as illustrated. Also, he suggested that there is a possibility of the 7th stage. Furthermore, Stage 0 was added by William Damon and Robert Selman. In the Zeptoform Theory, Stage 6 is called meta-conventional, and Stage 7 is called trans-conventional. These stages will be discussed step by step. At Stage 0, the right thing to do is defined by the lowest stage of the survival instinct. That is the consideration of my own survival. In terms of worldviews, this is the level of archaic. In the process from Stage 0 to Stage 1, obedience emerges. That is needed for getting rewards and avoiding punishments. In terms of worldviews, this is the shift, from archaic to tribal. In this process, the beast quality of Type 8 is repressed in order to be obedient. As already discussed, that is needed for getting rewards and avoiding punishments. At Stage 2, self-assertiveness emerges. That is the shift from tribal to rebellious. The rebelliousness is needed for doing what I think is right. At Stage 3 and Stage 4, conventional rules of society are adopted and internalized. In other words, a usual sense of ethics emerges from the conventional level. The difference between Stage 3 and Stage 4 will be discussed later. From Stage 5, people do not blindly follow conventional rules. That is, from the post-conventional level, people can disobey conventional rules for the greater good.
Note:
As discussed, on the post-conventional level, people can disobey conventional rules for the greater good. Because they can disobey conventional rules, superficially, they tend to resemble the people on the pre-conventional level. It is called pre-post fallacy. That will be discussed later.
Justice and care.
Justice and care can be seen as two major aspects of morality. The former is related to the equality of opportunity, which brings about the proportionality of outcome. On the other hand, the latter is related to the affirmative action of opportunity, which brings about the equality of outcome. Conservatives tend to value justice, and liberals tend to value care. However, in terms of care for family, conservatives tend to value care more than liberals do. In terms of centricity, the reason can be explained in the following way. Conservatives tend to focus on the conventional rules of the ethnocentric morality. With that said, according to Kohlberg, on the ethnocentric level, the equality of care is exemplified at Stage 3, and the proportionality of justice is exemplified at Stage 4. It was confirmed by William Damon's experimental research. These two stages are represented by the relationship between a mother and a father. On the conventional level, ethnocentric roles, or traditional roles of men and women, are highly valued. On this level, the ethic of care is the care for family, and that is functional in the home. That is related to the traditional roles of women. On the other hand, the ethic of justice is functional in the field of social activities. This is related to the traditional roles of men. These traditional roles indicate the following. In the process from Stage 3 to Stage 4, the centricity expands from the domain of family to that of society. As we have discussed, on the ethnocentric level, the ethic of care is the care for family, but, on the world-centric level, the ethic of care is care for generic other. As we can see in this figure, the world-centric level is divided into modern and postmodern, or rational and pluralistic. Care for generic other is exemplified at the postmodern pluralistic level. That is the ideology of liberals. On the other hand, on the modern rational level, the ethic of justice is exemplified by meritocracy, in which the proportionality of outcome is highly valued. That is the ideology of libertarians. In the process from modern to postmodern, there is a transitional stage, which is represented by point 6, as discussed in Chapter 1, Section 7. In the process from point 6 to point 6 merges into point 9 and disappears. Therefore, point 6 can be seen as a transitional point. At the transitional stage, we need to realize the negative aspects of modernity in a constructive way. Related to this, according to the Enneagram theory, in the process from point 3 to point 6, we need to realize the problematic aspects of Type 3 from the perspective of point 6. However, some people do not want to face these problems in a realistic way, becoming evasive. In that case, the regression process from the modern level to the tribal level happens, as illustrated. This regression was described by Riso and Hudson in the following way.
3s are usually focused on developing their careers, achieving, and getting ahead. But when they go to 9, they become strangely unresponsive and unfocused. When they go to 9, their lack of development are laid bare. They may regress to earlier parts of their life, replaying childhood triumphs or traumas.
As we can see, the process from point 3 to point 9 represents the regression process to the infant state. The tribal level liberals are mentally fragile, and they tend to deny inconvenient facts. They tend to look for magical solutions for any inconvenient problems, not facing the problems in a realistic way. The difference between liberals on the postmodern level and on the tribal level is the difference between the post-conventional and the pre-conventional. Pre-conventional liberals have a tendency to utilize the ideology of post-conventional liberals. It can be explained by the following analogy. Many different types of technologies were invented by the cognitive abilities of the modern level. However, once these technologies were invented, such as Internet, the people with lower levels of cognitive abilities tend to utilize them. In the same way, pre-conventional liberals have a tendency to utilize the ideology of post-conventional liberals. As illustrated in this figure, conservatives tend to focus on the ideology of the traditional level. On the other hand, liberals tend to focus on the ideology of the postmodern level as well as the tribal level. The difference between tribal level liberals and postmodern level liberals will be discussed step by step. The tribal level liberals tend to experience the process from tribal to rebellious, as illustrated. The rebellious level liberals tend to fight against conservatives in an aggressive way. That is, they represent liberal protesters or rioters. The process from point 9 to point 6 is described by Riso and Hudson in the following way.
9s try to dissociate from their anxiety, in order to maintain a peaceful equilibrium within themselves. When events around them become too stressful for this defense to work, they begin to experience the full intensity of their anxiety, and may become reactive and insecure. Like average 6s, the anger and anxiety of 9s are escalating. They use passive-aggressive tactics to assert their own needs. Their anxiety and rage can explode hysterically in irrational rants, random acts of violence, or paranoid delusions about the people around them, in the manner of unhealthy 6s. The person who was once so easygoing becomes overreacting, hysteric, anxiety-ridden.
In the process from point 9 to point 6 tends to be connected to the aggressiveness of point 8 through the process from point 6 to point 4 to point 2 and to point 8. These processes are disintegration processes, as mainly discussed in Chapter 1. On the rebellious level, Type 4 is represented by sexual Type 4. According to Claudio Naranjo, sexual Type 4 is more rebellious than Type 8. Related to this, Chestnut mentioned the teaching of Naranjo in the following way.
Naranjo says that this 4 subtype can be the angriest personality among the Enneagram types. They are most likely to be confused with Type 8s. Like 8s, they have easier access to anger than most types.
On the other hand, on the postmodern level, Type 4 is represented by social Type 4. Social Type 4 represents one aspect of postmodern feminism.
Note:
Unlike sexual Type 4 and social Type 4, self-preservation Type 4 does not represent main aspects of archetypal Type 4. Related to this, according to Claudio Naranjo, the countertype of Type 4 is self-preservation Type 4. As we have seen, liberals are divided into two different levels, the pre-conventional level and the post-conventional level. Because they are both non-conventional, there are some superficial similarities. Then, because of these similarities, some people tend to think that they are the same. This kind of misunderstanding is called the pre-post fallacy or the pre-trans fallacy. Ken Wilber mentioned Carol Gilligan in order to explain the pre-post fallacy with regard to abortion in the following way.
Gilligan took a group of women and asked them questions like, "Does a woman have a right to an abortion?" Gilligan found that they gave 3 different answers to that question. yes, no, and yes. The first type of answer was, yes, she has a right to an abortion, because what I say is right. The second type of answer was, no, she does not have a right to an abortion, because that is against the law, the Bible, and my society. The third type was, yes, under certain circumstances, she can do so, because you have to weigh the overall impact on everybody. And sometimes an abortion is a lesser evil. These three responses are called pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. We can also call these stages egocentric, ethnocentric, and world-centric.
Conservatives tend to value conventional rules, and thus they tend to say no to the question. On the other hand, liberals do not want to be restricted by conventional rules, and thus they tend to say yes. However, the motivations for saying yes are divided into two different levels. The motivation of the post-conventional level and that of the pre-conventional level. Pre-conventional liberals are on the egocentric level. Therefore, about abortion, they tend to say,
"This is my body, therefore, I can do whatever I want to do."
This is one type of egocentric reason for supporting abortion. Incidentally, a person on the post-conventional level might still say no to the question about abortion. However, in this case, the reason for saying no is not based on conventional rules. It is based on post-conventional considerations. That is, whether the answer is yes or no does not matter much. What matters is the reason for the answer. The confusion between pre-gender and transgender is another example of pre-trans fallacy. Pre-gender is represented by type 9 on the tribal level, and transgender is represented by type 9 on the postmodern level. Their difference is related to their levels of cognitive abilities. Pre-gender people tend to have a vague sense of self, and it is related to immaturity of the ego and the vagueness of gender identities. Because they have not yet developed ego strength, they tend to have higher suicide rates. Ego strength is a person's ability to deal with adversity. As already mentioned, pre-gender people do not have a clear sense of self. Related to this, their definition of gender is very vague. But they tend to have a strong attachment to their vague, unique gender identities. That is related to gender identity tribalism. On the other hand, authentic transgender people are beyond any attachment to any gender identities. That is what it means to transcend gender. Authentic transgender people can have clear definitions of genders, and thus, they can utilize gender qualities with awareness. Also, they can use these qualities without any attachment to them.
Note:
A new way of gender quality categorization will be discussed in Chapter 4. Chapter 3, Section 4, Centricity and Morality, Part 2. Tribalism, Nationalism, and Globalism. As discussed in the previous section, tribalism and globalism are related to the ideology of liberals. On the other hand, nationalism is related to the ideology of conservatives. Therefore, in order to integrate liberals and conservatives, the integration of tribalism, nationalism, and globalism is essential. Related to this, Yuval Noah Harari said the following:
Democracies find it hard to survive without the help of nationalism. Nationalism isn't about hating foreigners. Nationalism is about loving your compatriots. Most conflicts are within nations, which indicates that nationalism, or the right kind of nationalism, is actually quite weak. Nationalism is not about hating foreigners. Nationalism is about loving your compatriots. And currently, there is a global shortage of such love. The importance and fragility of nationalism also raises questions about the wisdom of trying to absorb too many immigrants too quickly. People who favor immigration often discount the very real problems that mass immigration poses to the national unity of countries, or else they discount the dangers of undermining the national sentiment. and the fact that in the absence of nationalism, democracy is constantly in danger of descending into tribalism.
As discussed in the previous section, tribalism is related to discriminatory attitudes towards outgroups, such as the discriminatory attitudes towards straight white males. The process from postmodern to metamodern can be seen as the process from liberalism to a new level of libertarianism, which integrates globalism, nationalism, and tribalism. However, when liberals fail to experience this integration process, the regression process from postmodern to traditional tends to happen, as illustrated. This is the regression process from the postmodern pluralistic worldview to the traditional mythic worldview. Also, it is the regression from world-centric to ethnocentric, or post-conventional to conventional. The political slogan, "Make America Great Again," can be seen as a typical ethnocentric ethic, prioritizing one's own people. Brexit is another example in the same way. Related to this, Yuval Noah Harari said the following.
Now, I've spent quite a long time on the bright side of nationalism, but of course it would be wrong to completely ignore the dark side. When nationalism goes to extreme, and it can foster dictatorial and even fascist tendencies. Fascism tells me that my nation is supreme and that I have exclusive obligations towards it. According to fascism, my nation is the only important thing in the world, and I shouldn't care about anyone or anything except my nation.
I guess many liberals out there view Trump and his government as kind of irredeemably bad. Mm-hmm. Is it just the philosophy of nationalism?
I think the underlying feeling or idea is that the political system, something is broken there. It doesn't empower. I think what we are seeing is the immediate human reaction. If something doesn't work, let's go back. Almost everywhere you see retrograde vision, let's make America great again. Like it was great, I don't know, in the 50s, in the 80s, sometime let's go back there. And I don't think this can work, but a lot of people, this is their gut instinct. And if you don't have some kind of global cooperation, nationalism just is not on the right level to tackle the problems of whether it's climate change or whether it's technological disruption. If you think about, for example, artificial intelligence, over the next 20, 30 years, pushing hundreds of millions of people out of the job market, this is a problem on a global level. It will disrupt the economy of all the countries. And similarly, if you think about, say, bioengineering and people being afraid of conducting, I don't know, genetic engineering research on humans, it won't help if just a single country let's say the US, outlaws all genetic experiments on humans. But China or North Korea continues to do it. So the US cannot solve it by itself, and very quickly the pressure on the US to do the same will be immense, because we are talking about high-risk, high-gain technologies. If somebody else is doing it, I can't allow myself to remain behind. The only way to have regulations, effective regulations on things like genetic engineering is to have global regulations. If you just have national regulations, nobody would like to stay behind.
In the process from postmodern to metamodern and to transcendent, we will be able to solve major technological problems on the global level. That is especially related to the invention of new technology. For example, as discussed in Chapter 2, Section 5, this process represents the invention of nuclear fusion reactors.
Unless we find solutions on a global level, entire countries could collapse. So in order to survive and flourish in the 21st century, humankind needs better global cooperation. I know that some politicians, like the US president, argue that there is an inherent contradiction between nationalism and globalism. There is no contradiction between nationalism and globalism. Globalism doesn't mean abandoning all national loyalties and traditions, and it certainly doesn't mean opening the border to unlimited immigration. I know that there is a conspiracy theory going around that globalists want to abolish all restrictions on immigration and flood Europe with tens of millions of foreigners. But this is complete nonsense. Globalism means a commitment to some global rules. These rules don't deny the uniqueness of each nation and the loyalty people should owe their nation. Rather, the global rules just regulate the relations between nations. Today, we can do it, and that's globalism in action. Now, this isn't a call for the establishment of a global government, which is a dangerous and unrealistic vision. Rather, I think our goal should be global harmony without uniformity, like an orchestra in which every instrument is different, but they all play in harmony. If all instruments are the same, there is uniformity, it's lifeless. If each instrument is doing its own thing in complete disregard of the others, what you get is terrible noise. We need to find a balanced middle path. So to conclude, my main message, or one of the main messages, is that we don't need to choose between nationalism and globalism because there is no contradiction between them. Without self-confident nations, humankind is more likely to split into warring tribes than to establish global cooperation. On the other hand, without global cooperation, no nation can deal with the challenges of the 21st century.
The shift from postmodern to metamodern is the shift from first tier to the second tier, as discussed in Section 2. This is the shift from ordinary mind to visionary mind. From the perspective of visionary mind, we can use the cognitive abilities of metalogic in order to integrate globalism and nationalism. It includes the integration of tribalism. Chapter 3, Section 5, Care, Justice, and Liberty.
Liberty.
There are two different aspects of liberty: lifestyle liberty and meritocratic liberty. Then, the opposite of liberty is restriction. Restriction of lifestyle liberty and that of meritocratic liberty. The liberty versus restriction spectrum is related to two major aspects of morality: care and justice. These aspects in this figure are related to political ideologies. Liberals tend to value care, and conservatives tend to value justice. Then, libertarians tend to value liberty, and totalitarians tend to value restriction. Totalitarianism is regarded as the most extreme and complete form of authoritarianism. Liberals and libertarians, for example, tend to support abortion, and that is related to lifestyle liberty, which is called pro-choice. On the other hand, conservatives and totalitarians tend to restrict lifestyle liberty. For example, they tend to sacrifice their own lifestyle liberty for their family and nation. Conservatives and libertarians tend to favor meritocratic liberty. That is, they tend to think that, when we work harder, we have a right to get more in proportion to what we contribute to society. That is related to justice. As discussed in Section 3, justice is related to proportionality of outcome. On the other hand, equality-seeking liberals do not support meritocratic liberty. The reason can be seen in the following way. If we support meritocratic liberty, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Liberals do not want this kind of situation. That is related to care, protecting weak individuals from harm. However, it tends to invalidate the responsibility of each individual person, allowing free riders or cheaters. Conservatives don't like it. Therefore, there is a conflict between liberals and conservatives. It can be seen as the conflict between care and justice. That is also related to the conflict between environmentalism and industrialism. Industrialism, which is based on justice for meritocracy, is especially supported by libertarians. The conflict between the environmentalism of liberals and the industrialism of libertarians can also be seen as the conflict between care for nature and liberty for economics. Also, it is related to the conflict between the affirmative action of liberals and the meritocracy of libertarians. It can be seen as the conflict between care for the weak and liberty for elites. Libertarians tend to value both lifestyle liberty and meritocratic liberty. In terms of lifestyle liberty, libertarians are similar to liberals. However, liberals do not totally support lifestyle liberty or personal liberty. For example, they do not support the freedom of speech of each individual person in order to protect the oppressed victims. In terms of meritocratic liberty, libertarians are similar to conservatives. However, conservatives do not totally support meritocratic liberty or economic liberty. It can be seen as the battle between the ethnocentric nationalism of conservatives versus the world-centric globalism of libertarians. Ethnocentric nationalism tends to restrict global free trade. The oppressors versus oppressed paradigm has mainly been developed through the perspective of care. It can be explained in the following way. Care is related to lifestyle liberty, and that is the care for oppressed victims. Then, in order to protect the oppressed victims, the restriction of meritocratic liberty is required. That is the punishment of privileged oppressors. As we can see, the perspective of care tends to see the world as the battle between privileged oppressors and oppressed victims. On the other hand, from the perspective of justice, privileged people can be seen as successful heroes, not oppressors. As already discussed, justice is related to proportionality of outcome, and thus that is related to meritocratic liberty. And meritocratic liberty tends to bring about privileged people. Also, from the perspective of justice, oppressed victims tend to be seen as lazy people. It brings about the restriction of lifestyle liberty of these people.
The cancel culture paradox.
The more we try to silence hate speech, the more hate speech tends to be amplified. That is called the cancel culture paradox. Because of this paradox, it is difficult to bring balance between protecting free speech and prohibiting hate speech. Free speech is related to meritocratic liberty, and prohibiting hate speech is related to restriction of meritocratic liberty. In reality, speech codes, which are intended to restrict hate speech, often backfire and harm the people we are trying to protect. Ultimately, harmful ideas cannot be defeated by censorship, but by constructive ideas through reasonable debate. In other words, free speech should not be prohibited. The origins of the concept of cancel culture trace back to around 2015, but the practice of canceling itself has older historical roots, dating back centuries.
The Weimar fallacy.
Weimar refers to Germany's Weimar Republic, existed between World War I and the rise of the Nazis. The Weimar fallacy refers to the misconception that Weimar Republic failed primarily due to an absence of censorship or legal restrictions on hate speech. In reality, Weimar Republic had laws against hate speech, closed down numerous Nazi publications, and even banned Hitler from speaking in some regions. That is, trying to silence hate speech without addressing underlying issues tends to end up with backfire. Therefore, in order to solve the moral paradox, we need to value free speech. Freedom to find truth is the key to integrating the two major aspects of morality, care and justice.
The drama triangle.
Oppressors, victims, and saviors can create a triangle, which is called the drama triangle. This triangle illustrates dysfunctional social interactions among the three roles. In this dynamic, individuals unconsciously adopt these roles and perpetuate a power game. The oppressor tends to dominate the victim feels oppressed, and the savior attempts to save the victim. These roles create a cycle of unhealthy relationships, perpetuating conflicts. The essence of the drama triangle is role switching, where participants shift from one role to another during a conflict. For example, historically, Jewish people have been seen as oppressed victims. However, younger generations have begun to view them as oppressors. Related to this, Jewish people are called hyper-white. Whiteness is considered to be the most dominant aspect of privileged oppressors. Also, according to The Economist, 1 in 5 young Americans thinks the Holocaust is a myth. Then, from the perspective of the oppressors versus oppressed paradigm, Jewish people as oppressors are seen as evil. That is related to anti-Semitism. Another example is the role switching of the Nazis. That was described by Brendan O'Neill in the following way.
You know, there was an era in which Nazis were arrested under a kind of hate speech legislation. They were punished, they were fined. That was in Weimar Germany in the 1920s and the early 1930s. Nazis were arrested for what they published. They were punished, they were fined for what they published. Do you know what they did as a consequence of that? They milked it. They presented themselves as victims. They won more support among the public and among the racist sections of the public by presenting themselves as the victims of authority. If you censor Nazis, you help Nazis. That's what history tells us.
As described by Brendan O'Neill, the Nazis experienced the role of victims before becoming oppressors. Also, the German public saw them as saviors. Furthermore, now, some pro-Hamas protesters or anti-Semitic protesters see the Nazis as heroes. Freedom of speech can be used to resolve the problem with the drama triangle by promoting open communication and constructive dialogue. When individuals feel free to express their thoughts and feelings without fear, it can lead to a more transparent exchange of ideas. This transparency can help in addressing underlying issues, and it potentially breaks the cycle of the drama triangle. According to transactional analysis, the victim needs to be transformed into the creator. The creator has the ability to create one's own prosperous reality from the inside, but the victim wants to get support from others. That is, the creator takes responsibility for their own thoughts, emotions, and actions, instead of being attached to the victim role or the victim mentality. Ironically, the savior, or the rescuer, tends to reinforce the victim mentality or dependency of the victim by trying to protect the victim. Therefore, it needs to be transformed into the coach. The coach provides guidance, encouragement, and accountability without taking responsibility away from others. Unlike the savior's overprotective tendencies, the coach offers genuine support by fostering autonomy, resilience, and self-reliance. The oppressor, or the persecutor, tends to attack or blame the victim and the savior. The oppressor needs to acknowledge the negative impact of his or her condemnation and needs to be transformed into the challenger. The challenger focuses on constructive feedback or constructive criticism, replacing anger and condemnation with curiosity and understanding, seeking to understand the underlying motivations of the victim and the savior. While the challenger shares some characteristics with the coach in terms of fostering development, it is more inclined towards providing challenges and creating an environment that promotes growth through overcoming obstacles. Challengers, creators, and coaches can create a triangle, which is called the empowerment dynamic triangle. In order to transform the drama triangle into the empowerment dynamic triangle, freedom of speech is essential. As already discussed, point 9 represents liberals. Then, in the process from point 9 to point 7, liberals will be able to experience the freedom of point 7. That is, in the Enneagram theory, point 7 represents freedom, or liberty. Related to this, liberals tend to value lifestyle liberty, which is also called personal liberty. However, there is the following problem. The quality of point 2, which represents care, tends to support the process from point 9 to point 7. But paradoxically, the quality of point 2 tends to be an obstacle to the experience of the total freedom of point 7. Point 2 represents a mother. Then, the process from point 9 to point 7 represents the process of growth of her child. In order for the child to be totally free, the child needs to be free from, or independent from, his or her mother. In other words, the freedom of point 7 needs to be supported by the strength of point 8. The strength of point 8 brings about independence, or freedom, from one's mother. However, the mother wants to be needed by her child because she wants to take care of her child, Therefore, the mother tends to be an obstacle to the experience of total freedom of oppressed people. Related to this, liberals tend not to support economic liberty, as well as freedom of speech, in order to protect the weak. In this way, liberal parents tend to make their children mentally weak. This weakness is represented by the tribal-level liberals. As already discussed, the mother quality of point 2 tends to be an obstacle for her children for acquiring the strength of point 8. Related to this, the value system of point 2 tends to consider the masculine quality of point 8 as toxic. With that said, ironically, the authentic quality of compassion, which is related to the ethic of care, cannot be experienced without the quality of point 8. The difference between fake compassion and true compassion can be explained in the following way. Fake compassion tries to ease the suffering of others in the short term, and it could make things worse over time. On the other hand, true compassion encourages others to experience pain courageously in order to face the problem, or truth. Then, it could resolve the problem permanently. When Type 9 is supported by the strength of Type 8, she will have the true courage to face any pain empathically. However, she tends to have the tendency to dissociate from the strength of the beast. Also, she tends to cover up the beast. In the process from tribal to rebellious, Type 9 is connected to the quality of Type 6 as well as Type 8. However, in this process, the strength of Type 8 is used in an unhealthy way, becoming aggressive. Related to this, according to the Enneagram theory, the process from point 9 to point 6 is considered to be a disintegration process. On the other hand, the process from point 9 to point 3 is considered to be an integration process. That is the process from tribal to modern. In this process, Type 9 is connected to the strength of point 8 in a constructive way. Unlike Type 9, Type 3 tends to utilize the beast quality of Type 8, and that is used to support the free action of Type 7. In this way, the liberty of point 7 is included in the quality of point 3, which represents libertarians. As illustrated in this figure, libertarians tend to focus on the ideology of the modern level. Also, higher levels of libertarians tend to focus on the meta-modern level and the transcendent level. As already discussed, libertarians tend to value freedom, or liberty. Also, as we will discuss in Chapter 4, they tend to have higher cognitive abilities and tend to focus on scientific facts. Higher cognitive abilities are needed to integrate many different factors. For example, in order to have higher levels of morality, we need to consider many different factors in reality, and for this consideration, higher levels of cognitive abilities are required. That is, in order to integrate justice and care, higher levels of cognitive abilities are required. Cognitive functions will mainly be discussed in the next chapter. Chapter 3, Section 6, Transcendentals. Plato's idea of truth, goodness, and beauty are called Transcendentals, and these are related to science, ethics, and art. In the Zeptoform Theory, truth is replaced by logos as illustrated. The reason can be explained in the following way. Logos is the logical principle that governs the whole universe. Finding logos in truth is related to science. Finding goodness in truth is related to ethics, and finding beauty in truth is related to art. That is, truth is not just objective correctness. Logos, goodness, and beauty are three aspects of truth. The perspective of science is objective. On the other hand, the perspectives of ethics and art are subjective. Then, in this figure, the right side represents individual, and the left side represents relational. Therefore, for example, the lower right domain represents the perspective of I. Related to this, Shakespeare said, "Beauty is in the eye of the beholder." In this way, the perspective of I is related to that of art. On the other hand, the lower left domain represents the perspective of we. That is, when individual beings get together, they tend to create ethics. In other words, ethics emerges from the interactions among we. The subjective perspective of we is also called the intersubjective perspective. Intersubjectivity encompasses multiple subjective perspectives, shared cognitive perspectives, emerging from interactions among multiple individuals. It emphasizes broader cultural contexts.
Note:
The term relational can be replaced with the term collective. In this section, these terms will be used interchangeably. In this section, in order to analyze the Transcendentals, we use the Zeptoform. First of all, the Zeptoform is rotated 60 degrees counterclockwise, as illustrated. The perspective of point 5, point 1, and point 4 correspond to the Transcendentals, which are science, ethics, and art. These are perfect correlations.
Collective versus individual.
Collective versus individual is related to extrovert versus introvert. That is, extroverts tend to interact with people, which are the collective of individuals. On the other hand, introverts tend to be individualistic. For example, the people with type 1 personality are extroverts. They tend to value social norms, which emerge from the collective of individuals. On the other hand, the people with type 4 personality are introverts. They are the most individualistic type among all Enneatypes. That is, they tend to value the uniqueness or originality of I, and not to assimilate into social norms. The people with type 5 personality are also introverts. However, unlike point 4, point 5 is located not only in the domain of individual, but also collective. That is, although 5s tend not to interact with the people in the social world, they tend to observe the system of the whole world, which is the collective of many different objects. That is related to the perspective of holy omniscience.
The domain of we.
Point 1 represents the domain of we. It is the domain of ethics as well as society. The domain of society can be expanded to point 2 and point 7. These 3 points represent different aspects of society. These are justice, care, and liberty. These 3 factors were discussed in the previous section. The domain of I versus they. In this figure, point 8 includes both red and blue, representing collective and individual. From here, the left side and the right side are reversed. The reason will be discussed later. The function of point 8 represents the separation between individual and collective. This is the function of the survival instinct, which is also called the self-preservation instinct. The self-preservation instinct needs to separate oneself from others in order to preserve oneself. The self-preservation instinct includes the combative instinct. That causes the conflict between I versus they. In this figure, we can see the violation of CP symmetry. As mainly discussed in Chapter 2, C symmetry is the symmetry of yin and yang, and P symmetry is the symmetry of left and right. In this figure, the inversion symmetry of yin and yang is represented by the relationship between individual and collective. That is, according to the yin-yang principle, big, many, and plural are yang. The domain of yang brings about interactions among multiple elements. According to the yin-yang principle, the yang quality tends to dominate the yin quality. The symmetry of left and right brings about a one-to-one correspondence between the elements of the left side and the right side. Having said that, by definition, there is no one-to-one correspondence between singular and plural, or individual and collective. In other words, the concept of individual versus collective brings about the violation of symmetry.
The domain of you.
Point 9 represents the domain of you. That is the perspective of empathy. In order to take the perspective of empathy, we need to set aside our own subjective perspectives. That is the perspective of point 9. Sandra Matry said,
Nines are excellent mediators, able to see everyone's point of view.
As discussed in Chapter 1, Nines do not have their own clear sense of self. They have a tendency to assimilate into other people. By comparing the perspective of you and that of we, the characteristics of the perspective of you become clearer. In the Zeptoform Theory, the perspective of we is represented by point 1, point 7, and point 2. Their perspectives are different from the perspective of you. Ones and twos, for example, are willpower types, and they have a tendency to prioritize their own opinions and value systems, such as the ethic of justice and that of care. This tendency makes it difficult for them to take the perspective of another person, you. This is related to political battles between different ideologies, such as the battle between the patriarcha value system versus the matriarchal value system. In contrast, nines have a tendency to take the perspective of another person, you. By comparing sympathetic type 2 and empathetic type 9, the difference between the perspective of we and that of you becomes clearer. Type 2 tends to be sympathetic, that is, feeling for someone. On the other hand, type 9 tends to be empathetic, that is, feeling as someone. The similarities and differences between type 9 and type 2 are described by Riso and Hudson in the following way.
There are a number of similarities between these types. But the way 2s and 9s love others is quite different. 9s are unself-conscious, seldom focusing on themselves. They are self-effacing and accommodating, quite content to support others emotionally without looking for a great deal of attention or appreciation in return. Unlike average 9s, average 2s have a very sharp sense of their own identities. They are not particularly self-effacing or accommodating. Rather than being unself-conscious, they are highly aware of their feelings and virtues and are more likely to talk about them.
As we can see, type 2 is sympathetic, and type 9 is empathetic. When we are empathetic towards someone, we are experiencing that person from the perspective of that person. We become that person. In other words, in order to be empathetic, we need to set aside our own perspectives. On the other hand, when we are sympathetic towards someone, we are still seeing that person from our own perspectives. According to Riso and Hudson, type 9 tends to assimilate into other people in the following way.
Average 9s have little sense of who they are apart from those they have identified with. They see a little of themselves in all the types. It is based on their capacity to be receptive to others.
Unlike type 9, type 2 is not particularly empathetic. In order to be empathetic, we need to set aside our own perspectives. But, because type 2 is a willpower type, it is difficult for type 2 to set aside her own perspective. Because of this, type 2 tends to be meddlesome. Type 2 wants to take care of people based on her strong will. By analyzing the motivation of type 7, the difference between the perspective of we and that of you becomes much clearer. Riso and Hudson said,
7s see themselves as members of a free-floating band of fellow adventurers, whose own enjoyment is enhanced by being with others. 7s do not like to eat or drink alone, or go to the theater alone, or go on vacation alone, but this does not always mean that they are great lovers of people. But, it is certainly true that their activities are more enjoyable when others are around to contribute to the excitement and stimulation they seek. To provide themselves with the company of others, 7s may pay for the pleasure, buying tickets for poorer friends, inviting them to dinner or the country house, and so forth. 7s may thus exhibit a certain generosity, although their motives may well have less to do with helping needier friends, than with making sure that they themselves have a good time by having others around.
As we can see, although 7s want to belong to the domain of we, they are not interested in having the perspective of you. They want to prioritize their own enjoyment. As already discussed, in order to experience the perspective of you, we need to set aside our own preferences. That is exactly the opposite of the motivation of type 7. Among many people, some people are having the same interest or the same value system from the beginning. In this case, they can create a group, naturally, without having the perspective of you. For example, 7s tend to create a group of a free-floating band of fellow adventurers, as described by Riso and Hudson. However, in order to bring harmony among different groups, we need to use the perspective of you. In other words, in order to expand the domain of we, the perspective of you is essential. The perspective of point 6 can be considered to be the perspective of the seeker, who is seeing all the domains. Through the process from point 6 to point 9, the trust of point 6 and the empathy of point 9 are connected. This figure was discussed in Chapter 1, Section 7. When two people are facing each other with trust and empathy, point 6, which is trust, and point 9, which is empathy, are superposed. That is, the perspectives of mine and that of yours are connected by trust and empathy. Through this connection, we can understand each other. From the perspective of point 6, the structure of the Zeptoform can be seen in many different ways. For example, the Zeptoform can be seen as the perspectives of your friend, and you are facing him or her. Or, it can be seen as a mirror, and you are seeing the reflection of your own perspectives. In this case, the left side and the right side are reversed, because that is a reflection from the mirror. In this section, we are mainly using this reversed version. When point 6 is inverted from the front side to the back, entering into point 9 is experienced from the back. We can enter into the heart through the back. According to some spiritual teachings, entering into the heart through the back is more effective. When you are supporting someone from the back, this person and you are seeing the same direction, experiencing the same perspective. This is the experience of empathy. Related to this, as already discussed, entering into the heart through the back can be more effective. This process, the process from point 6 to point 9, needs to be experienced on the postmodern level. Then, in the process from point 9 to point 3, and to another point 3, we can integrate all perspectives. It includes the integration of care and justice. Chapter 3, Section 7, Transcend and Integrate, Part 1. From subject to object. A subject is something, which is experienced as I. An object is something, which is observed as it. In a process of spiritual awakening, the subject of one stage becomes an object of the next stage's subject. For example, we tend to experience our body as I, which is the subject. But we can disidentify with the body, and the body becomes it, which is an object. On the next level, our thoughts and emotions tend to be experienced as I, but we can disidentify with them, and they become its. In this objectification process, we can realize that our consciousness is observing our thoughts and emotions as objects. That is, our consciousness as the witness is the ultimate subject, which is the true self. In order to recognize the true self, we need to know the difference between the thinking self and the observing self. When these two different selves are compared, which self do you think is the core of yourself? This question can be analyzed in the following way. You are not always thinking. When you are not thinking, the thinking self disappears. Our thoughts and emotions are temporary or ephemeral, and ephemeral things cannot be called the core. On the other hand, the observing self is always there except when we are unconscious. Therefore, the observing self can be seen as the core of yourself. There is another way to analyze these two selves. You are not an object, but the subject, and the observing self, as the subject, can observe your thoughts and feelings as objects. You can objectify your thoughts and feelings. You, as the observing self, can treat your thoughts and feelings as objects. Therefore, the observing self can be seen as the core of yourself. Eckhart Tolle, who is the author of The Power of Now, described the realization of the two selves in the following way.
I would briefly like to tell you how I came to be a spiritual teacher, and how this book came into existence. Until my 30th year, I lived in a state of almost continuous anxiety, interspersed with periods of suicidal depression. The most loathsome thing of all, however, was my own existence. What was the point in continuing to live with this burden of misery? Why, carry on with this continuous struggle? I cannot live with myself any longer. This was the thought that kept repeating itself in my mind. Then, suddenly, I became aware of what a peculiar thought it was. Am I one or two? If I cannot live with myself, there must be two of me.
They are the thinking self and the observing self.
Maybe, I thought, only one of them is real. I was so stunned by this strange realization, that my mind stopped. I was fully conscious, but there were no more thoughts. Suddenly, there was no more fear.
He was able to differentiate the thinking self from the core of himself. That is the transcendence of the thinking self. Consequently, he became free from any negative thoughts and feelings. Also, he experienced the state of unconditional inner peace. There are 3 steps for the process of spiritual awakening. Step 1 is realizing the current level of I. Step 2 is disidentifying with this I. Then, Step 3 is integrating this particular level of I from the next higher level of I. This is the process of transcending and integrating, or differentiating and including. We can repeat this process in order to expand the frame of I. As discussed, the process of spiritual awakening is the process of transcending and integrating. In order to transcend the current level of I, we must first differentiate it. That is, differentiation is a part of the transcending process. Then, in order to integrate the lower level of I from the perspective of the upper level of I, we must first re-include the lower level of I. That is, inclusion is a part of the integration process. The perspective of self-realization is represented by the perspective of Type 4. Type 4 has a tendency to identify with her artistic sensitivity on the feeling level, and it becomes an obstacle to transcending her ego identity. Riso and Hudson said,
4s find it difficult to transcend self-consciousness, because just the reverse is what they want, to become more conscious of their feelings so that they can find themselves, and arrive at a firm sense of identity. But, as they become more self-conscious, 4s become increasingly drawn into unresolved, contradictory, and irrational feelings. They try to understand themselves by introspecting on their feelings. As they move inward in a search for self, they become so acutely self-conscious that their subjective emotional states become the dominant reality.
in order for Type 4 to find her true identity, she needs to transcend the feeling level. In order to transcend the feeling level, she needs to differentiate or objectify her feelings. This differentiation, or objectification, is experienced in the process from point 4 to point 1. As illustrated in this figure, this objectification process needs to be guided by the insight of point 5. By superimposing the Transcendentals, we can see the following. The perspective of point 5 is the perspective of it and its. That is needed for the objectification process. This process, the process from point 4 to point 1, was described by Riso and Hudson in the following way.
When very healthy 4s go to 1, they move from the world of subjectivity to the world of objectivity. They are no longer controlled by their feelings, but by their convictions, beyond their personal interest and emotional gratification. Because integrating 4s have transcended themselves, what they create is objective.
As described by Riso and Hudson, in the process from point 4 to point 1, the perspective of Type 4 is shifted from the world of subjectivity to that of objectivity. This objective viewpoint can be deepened by the perspective of point 5. The perspective of point 4 is the perspective of I. On the other hand, the perspective of point 1 is the perspective of we. Therefore, the process from point 4 to point 1 can be experienced as the process from I to we. Also, in this process, the perspective of we can be experienced as super-I. That is related to the concept of the hive mind, or the universal mind. The essential aspect of Type 4, which is called the point, is a point of light. On the other hand, the essential aspect of Type 1, which is called brilliancy, is the collective of infinite points of light. Therefore, the process from type 4 to type 1 is the process from individual to collective. This collective is experienced as the indivisible oneness of all existence. This realization was described by Almas in the following way.
Brilliancy is the father of the point. Through the function of the point, you can attain a quality of brilliancy. That is more like what people call God. Brilliancy is frequently related to God's will. The point is a brilliant point that is who you are, your true self. It is part of the living ocean of brilliancy.
As described by Almas, the point of type 4 can be seen as a part of the living ocean of brilliancy, which is the collective of infinite points. As we have seen, the process from point 4 to point 1 is the process from the domain of I to that of we. On the other hand, the process from point 2 to point 4 is the process from the domain of we to that of I, and this process needs to be supported by the strength of point 8, as discussed in Chapter 1, Section 3. In this process, we can deepen the perspective of I. That is the perspective of self-realization. Then, in the process of point 4 to point 1, we can expand the domain of self-realization. As we have seen, the developmental process of integral hierarchy is transcending and integrating. Point 1 represents perfection, in which all aspects are included. Then, from the perspective of point 5, which is omniscience, all included aspects are integrated. As discussed previously, inclusion is a part of integration process. This figure was discussed in Chapter 1, Section 2. In this figure, we can see the function of the brilliancy diamond, which brings about the process of inclusion and integration. In this figure, the process from point 9 to point 2 to point 4 and to point 1 is illustrated. As already discussed, the first step of transcending and integrating is realizing the current level of I. Among all enneatypes, type 9 has the most difficulty in identifying his or her own enneatype. That is, type 9 tends to have a vague sense of self. But, in the process from point 9 to point 2 and to point 4, type 9 will be able to realize his or her own identity by using the insight of type 4. That is, in this process, type 9 will be able to have a mature sense of self. In this process, point 9 needs to be connected to the strength of point 8. As we have seen, from the perspective of type 4, we can experience the process of identification. Then, the next stage is disidentification with this particular identity. It includes disidentification with any particular enneatype. Although, type 4 tends to have a difficulty in differentiating one's identity, in the process from point 4 to point 1, we can disidentify with one's personality type. Then, at point 1, all enneatypes are included. Furthermore, from the perspective of point 5, all included enneatypes are integrated.
Integration of shadows.
The dark side of our psyche is called the shadow. As discussed in Chapter 2, Section 9, shadows can be divided into two major categories. One is called attachment shadows, and the other one is called avoidance shadows. Attachment is fixation, addiction, philia, grasping, etc. On the other hand, avoidance is alienation, allergy, phobia, rejecting, etc. When we fail to transcend or differentiate an element of a certain level, an attachment shadow is created. When we fail to integrate or include an element of a certain level, an avoidance shadow is created. When something is considered to be bad, it tends to create a shadow. For example, type 2 tends to think that the masculine quality or the beast quality is bad. Because of this, she tends to deny the beast quality in herself, and it becomes a shadow. The shadow is projected onto others. Consequently, she tends to be aggressive against the masculine quality of others. It is related to some feminist movements. Type 9 tends to assimilate into the quality of type 2, and thus she also has the tendency to avoid or cover up the beast quality, creating an avoidance shadow. Also, In this process, she tends to be attached to the mother quality of type 2, creating an attachment shadow. Type 9, which represents liberals, tend to see the world from the perspective of care of point 2. That is the connection between type 9 and type 2. This connection tends to cause the sleeping mode, as mainly discussed in Chapter 1. The sleeping mode tends to cause the denial of inconvenient truth. That is intrinsically related to the hierarchy problem. The hierarchy problem of point 9 is represented by the denial of the out and the in of the instinctive center, or the beast and God, creating avoidance shadows. The relationship between the beast and God represents the archetype of hierarchical levels, and type 9 tends to deny this hierarchical structure. Related to this, from the perspective of radical liberal idealists, any hierarchical structure is considered to be evil. Then, they try to fight against masculine qualities, which are related to the hierarchical structure. However, in order to fight against them, they tend to use masculine qualities unconsciously. That is, they tend to experience the process from point 2 to point 8. In this process, type 9 becomes like an unhealthy type 6. They become aggressive like the beast, but, at the same time, they tend to deny their own aggressiveness. This neglected aspect of the psyche is called a shadow.
Note:
The main ethic of liberals is care. However, in the process from point 9 to point 6, they tend to become an unhealthy version of social justice warriors. They become passive-aggressive towards unjust people. They become like unhealthy version of type 6. Related to this, according to Jonathan Haidt, social justice is not real justice. In the process from point 9 to point 3, type 9 will be able to integrate the out and the in of the instinctive center, as we have seen in Chapter 1. Also, in this process, type 9 will be able to differentiate the quality of point 2. As already discussed, in order to integrate an attachment shadow, we must first differentiate it.
Integration of a father figure.
As already discussed, point 9 represents liberals. Then, the integration of the shadow for liberals can be seen as the integration of conservatives. With that said, the integration of conservatism is related to the integration of a father figure. Point 9, point 2, and point 4 represent the main aspects of feminine qualities. On the other hand, point 1 represents the authoritative paternal figure. It indicates the following. In the process from point 4 to point 1, the feminine quality of point 4 needs to be integrated with the father quality of point 1. The essential quality of point 1 is the intelligence of brilliancy. When we work on the intelligence of brilliancy, the issue with our father tends to arise. Almas described this relationship between the intelligence and a father in the following way.
I didn't mention the word father this morning, and yet, after the first exercise on the intelligence of brilliancy, everybody was talking about their father. It is obvious that there must be some connection between intelligence and father. What is this relationship? How come you found that the question of brilliancy and intelligence is connected to father?
As described by Almas, the quality of point 1, which is brilliancy, is related to the quality of one's father and his intelligence. Therefore, in the process from point 4 to point 1, we need to work on the issue with our father and intelligence. Related to this, Almas said the following.
Many of you started talking about your relationship with your father as we began to explore this essential aspect. It seems mysterious and miraculous, but these are the facts as we have found them in 25 years of work with thousands of students. I take it to mean that our universe has an implicit order that we can perceive if we are interested in exploring the truth of our experience. This aspect, which is brilliancy, becomes connected with God, the Father, for many individuals. God in the Judeo-Christian sense is more of the Father, the masculine kind of God. God, the Father, has the sense of overseeing and enveloping, a presence that is both powerful and intelligent. So, clarifying your relationship to God, and more specifically, your relationship to brilliancy, becomes a matter of dealing with the relationship with your father. Sometimes, we project some of the qualities like those of power, density, and immensity on a father that seems aggressive and angry, and we end up associating power and immensity with some kind of negativity. The issues that prevent us from experiencing the brilliancy are the conflicts in the relationship with father.
Brilliancy is the essence of perfection, and that is related to the ethic of justice. The word justice is related to the word just, which indicates no excesses and no deficiencies, and thus it indicates perfection. Ultimately, the realization of justice is related to the realization of holy perfection, which brings about the experience of brilliancy.
Note:
According to the Enneagram theory, the sleeping mode of type 9 can be seen as the core of shadows. Then, as discussed in Chapter 2, Section 9, these shadows are represented by the neutralino, which is the primary candidate for dark matter, as we discussed. Chapter 3, Section 8, Transcend and Integrate, Part 2.
The reference point.
When we are judging something, we are using a reference point. When we are using higher reference points for evaluation, we cannot be easily satisfied with anything. We tend to be frustrated. Therefore, we need to lower the reference points for evaluation. Related to this, psychologists found out the following. Although there is a correlation between poverty and unhappiness, that is not causation. The direct cause of unhappiness is one's interpretation of the gap between poorer people and richer people. In other words, using higher reference points for evaluation is the cause of unhappiness. By accepting the shadow unconditionally, we can lower the reference point for evaluation. In many cases, we are using reference points unconsciously. Therefore, we cannot control them. However, in the process of objectification, which is the objectification of the thinking self, we will be able to objectify our reference points. That is, unconscious reference points become conscious. Consequently, we will be able to control reference points. In other words, we will be able to control the degree of our happiness. However, in some cases, even if we are able to objectify reference points, it is difficult to control them. In these cases, we need to accept them, rather than trying to control anything. Also, we need to realize the following. When we are trying to control reference points, we are evaluating this controlling process based on a new reference point. That is, we are creating another reference point, and this new reference point tends to be unconscious. Therefore, we need to work on this new reference point. As already discussed, by accepting the shadow unconditionally, we can lower the reference point for evaluation. Consequently, we can experience unconditional inner peace. All shadows have basic distrust. In order to transform basic distrust into basic trust, we need to embrace shadows unconditionally. In order to embrace shadows, we can use the following phrase. I accept your whole being, as it is, fully and completely. I accept you unconditionally. Then, you invite the shadow into your heart, which is shining green. This is the process from point 6 to point 9. That is, the shadow is located at point 6, and you invite the shadow into point 9, which is in your heart. Now, from the perspective of the shadow, feel what it is like to be the shadow. This is the experience of empathy. As already discussed, by accepting the shadow unconditionally, we can lower the reference point for evaluation. Consequently, we can experience unconditional inner peace.
The motivation for evolution.
In the process of transcending and integrating, we can reach to the highest motivations. Highest motivations have variations. Authentic hope, for example, is one of them. That is different from ordinary hope. Ordinary hope is the hope for the future, wishing for things to get better. It denies the now. In contrast, authentic hope is the realization of perfect fulfillment at any moment. That is the process of overcoming any challenges. and every moment of the process itself becomes meaningful. As already discussed, the reference point for evaluation needs to be lowered, but the motivation for evolution needs to be raised. In this figure, the lower reference point is represented by point 9, and the higher motivation is represented by point 3. In the process from point 9 to point 3, we need to keep the lowest reference point for evaluation, and at the same time, we need to raise the motivation for evolution. Then, what happens if they are reversed? When the reference point evaluation is raised, we become greedy, and the motivation for evolution is lowered, we become lazy. Therefore, we need to have the lower reference point for evaluation and the higher motivation for evolution.
Note:
The process from point 9 to point 3 is experienced as the process from point 9 to point 7, to point 5, and to point 3. In this process, point 9 is connected to point 8 through the function of point 3. Also, this process needs to be integrated with the process from point 9 to point 2, to point 4, and to point 1. In this figure, point 3 superposes on point 1. In the process of evolution, our purpose needs to be process-oriented, not goal-oriented. When our purpose is goal-oriented, we tend to think that only when we achieve something, we can be happier. In other words, our happiness is always in the future, not now. On the other hand, when our purpose is process-oriented, we have no attachment to any outcome. Also, we will be able to maximize the value of the process itself, the value of the now moment. The following story illustrates the difference between process-oriented and goal-oriented. A boy and his father were playing on a beach. While they were creating a sand castle, a big wave came and destroyed it. The father was very disappointed. On the other hand, the boy was happy seeing it, enjoying the now moment. It was like playing with Shiva, the Hindu god of destruction. That is, the purpose of the boy was process-oriented, and that of his father was goal-oriented. The boy had no attachment to any outcome, goal, or achievement, but his father did. As already discussed, the reference point for evaluation needs to be lowered, but the motivation for evolution needs to be raised.
Note:
In the process of integrating shadows, the motivations of the shadow tend to shift from extrinsic to intrinsic. Extrinsic motivation is neediness, wanting to get something from the outside. On the other hand, intrinsic motivation is the expression of the fullness of the inside. That is, in this process, we realize that we don't need to get anything from the outside in order to be fulfilled. Our inside is already fulfilled. Chapter 3, Section 9, States of Consciousness. States indicate states of consciousness, and there are 5 major states. In this figure, we can see 3 of them. From the bottom, there is the gross state, the subtle state, and the causal state. The gross state, which is the state of the biological self, is a usual waking state. The subtle state, which is the state of a soul, is a dreaming state, or a state of meditation. The causal state, which is the state of the spirit, is a deep dreamless sleeping state, or a deep state of meditation. It is the subtlest state, subtler than the subtle state. The emptiness state is the cessation of existence, and it is also called the void. In this state, there is no level. Everything ceases to exist in this state. There are 4 stages of emptiness, and the first 3 stages can be seen as quasi-emptiness. The first stage of emptiness can be experienced in the gross state in the following way. When we are performing some activities in a fully immersed way, the action and consciousness, or the physical body and effortless mind, are merged into one. At that moment, thoroughly focused on the present moment, hours seem to pass by a minute. This timeless state is considered to be the first stage of quasi-emptiness. It is also called the flow state. The second stage of emptiness can be experienced in the subtle state in the following way. When we focus on the image of emptiness during meditation, we become one with the image of emptiness. That is called samadhi. The third stage of emptiness can be experienced in the causal state in the following way. When we are meditating, we can experience pure consciousness, and it is called the witness. In this state, even the image of emptiness, or the concept of emptiness, does not exist. There is only pure consciousness. In Hindu philosophy, the highest end of the causal level is called turiya. In terms of experience, this is the subtlest state of all states. The fourth stage of emptiness is the real emptiness state. In this state, even the witness or pure consciousness ceases to exist. Therefore, there is no experience in this state. The cessation of consciousness is described by Almas in the following way.
And so there was no awareness, nothing, complete cessation, complete annihilation of experience at all. And then awareness emerged from that. Buddha himself said cessation was fundamental for him. In my experience, cessation is fundamental.
Can I ask you a question,
Yeah.
Hamid?
Yeah.
About this nothing that you speak of beyond or prior to awareness.
Yeah.
From your own experience, what is your experience of that nothing?
No experience.
If you have no experience of it, how can you legitimately claim it to be? On what grounds are you speaking of it if it is not your experience? It's obviously not a belief because you speak of it with great conviction.
Because
but if it's not
there is a gap in experience.
what is it that is aware of that gap? If you claim
Well,
that
the
gap
awareness emerges again from that gap.
but if you say awareness emerges from the gap,
Yeah.
then it means that the gap had no awareness in it.
Yes.
So on what grounds are you claiming the presence of that gap? Because it cannot be your experience. Because there must be awareness there to say there is a gap of nothing.
No, awareness can get, well, I could tell you how it started, which was awareness, consciousness, conscious of itself. And at some points I'm just that, and I was with my friend Karen, who was there with me, participating in the experience. And as I'm the awareness aware of itself, and then the awareness became aware of some kind of emptiness, some kind of spaciousness. And then I started seeing as if the awareness began to disperse. Awareness that are surrounded by absolute nothingness, absolute darkness, no knowing, and that continued to disperse until some point, pop, there was no experience. And asked my friend how long was. She says it was a few minutes. And then I asked her, what did you see happening? She said, you disappeared.
But what was your experience when awareness disappeared?
There was no experience. There was no experience. Absolutely total cessation of awareness.
But in that case, on what grounds are you claiming it to this gap of no thing in the absence of awareness? If you weren't aware of it, how do you know it was there?
After that developed, where I can look back at that, in the moment, I could look back. Similarly to the way Nisargadatta Maharaj talks about himself. He said, if you open your eyes, the world appears. You look back at yourself, you disappear.
If you feel this emptiness approaching, and at a certain stage, you say the awareness disappears, and then there's a blank, and then awareness reappears again, and you look back on it. So awareness is present as you approach the blank. Awareness is present when you look back on the blank. That I understand it, but what I'm interested in is not the approach to this nothing, or the looking back on the nothing. How do we know it's there? How can we claim it to be real?
Very good.
If we're not aware of it?
Well, several things. That's a good question, I think. It's a very nice question. I appreciate that, Rupert. And because I ask myself that question, especially the other tradition that says no, forget about it. First of all, my friend Karen was there, and I can ask her about
But Karen
it.
cannot cannot
It's
validate
true.
your
It
experience.
is my experience of her telling me that.
Yeah, but that don't, I mean,
Yeah.
if we're going to base our experience on what other people tell us, I mean, that's like somebody saying, you disappeared in deep sleep.
Now, Rupert Spira is focusing only on the first-person perspective. That is the perspective of phenomenology. Phenomenologists reject the validity of the third-person perspective. Related to this, there is a conversation between Rupert Spira and Sam Harris. First, Spira said the following.
Nobody does ever, or has ever, or indeed could ever experience anything outside consciousness.
Yes,
So,
that's certainly true.
So a materialist scientist's belief that there is something outside consciousness, namely matter, is an unverifiable belief. It's something that it's a model that will never be able to be proven. Consciousness is the ultimate reality of the universe, and everything can be explained using the consciousness-only model.
Then, Sam Harris started to talk about anesthesia.
You can get general anesthesia and see that that's an unusual experience that has some implications for the possibility that consciousness can be interrupted.
I had general anesthesia a couple of months ago, actually.
How did it seem to you?
And I experienced no discontinuity of consciousness.
So what does that mean? So you were aware of something throughout?
No, there was a discontinuity in what I was aware of, but I didn't have the sense that there had been a discontinuity of consciousness.
And how long was your surgery?
I don't know, half an hour or so.
Okay. So there was a half hour there that you weren't aware of, and yet in that space, there was something being done to you, there were conversations being had, there was somebody controlling the anesthesia, they brought you down, they brought you back, and all of that, it's not contained within the primary field of data that is consciousness in your own case, right? So if we only had your experience to go on, your experience of the cosmos, there would just be this hiatus that would be completely inscrutable. And yet we know by, you can know by inference, you can know by conversation with others, that all of this other stuff happened in those 30 minutes that explain the character of what happened to you. If what happened to you just spontaneously happened, it would be entirely mysterious. You would just lost 30 minutes of life, and you couldn't account for it. But here we have all these people who can account for it because they have produced this effect in you. I'm saying that the temptation to be a materialist, whatever word you want to use to describe all of these happenings outside of any one individual's awareness, the kinds of assumptions that you're recoiling from here, they're not true, or very rarely made true, by the merely first-person intuitions that anyone can arrive at by virtue of meditation or introspection or direct self-inquiry. There's a different language game that's being played that gets you things like anesthesiologists and all the rest. These are not the sort of data we get in hand merely by paying attention to the nature of consciousness.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Okay, so I think we should just close the door to this particular disagreement, because I think it actually doesn't matter. It's interesting that you and I could choose to see things differently at that level.
As we can see, there are some situations in which you need to refer to the observation of the third person in order to know the experience of your own. However, there is another way to speculate about what happened during surgery. That is, by paying attention to the difference between the physical as well as mental conditions before the surgery and after the surgery, we can tell the influence of the surgery. Related to this, Alma said the following.
Yeah, but there's another reason.
Sorry, okay,
The other
I
reason,
interrupted
the
you.
result of that
Yes.
is that awareness, after having that experience, awareness itself changed character. Awareness itself changed character so that awareness has no self-reflection. And
Yes.
meaning that awareness doesn't reflect back on itself. And in that, also, the lack of self-reflection eliminated the sense of I.
As described by Almas, the real emptiness state is the state of non-existence. Even pure consciousness, which is called turiya, does not exist. Therefore, it eliminates the sense of I. However, in some spiritual teachings, turiya is considered to be the real emptiness state, and thus it is included in one of the 5 major states. In other words, in these teachings, the total emptiness, which is the disappearance of consciousness, is not included in the 5 major states.
Note:
We have discussed the 4 major states. Then, the 5th major state will be discussed from here.
Transcendence of existence and non-existence.
The gross, subtle, and causal states are the states of existence. On the other hand, the emptiness state is the state of non-existence. Then, the transcendence of the duality between existence and non-existence is called the non-dual, or the absolute. The realization of the absolute includes the realization of the real emptiness state. This is the realization of CPT symmetry, as discussed in Chapter 2, Section 3, according to the CPT theorem, when time and space are compressed into a single point, yin and yang of the universe are totally annihilated. At the same time, the universe itself is annihilated. That is the perfect cessation of everything. As discussed previously, there are 4 stages of emptiness. Therefore, the realization of non-dual also has 4 stages. The first stage of non-dual is the transcendence of body versus mind. The second stage of non-dual is the transcendence of the concept of existence versus the concept of non-existence. The third stage of non-dual is the transcendence of concept versus no concept, or the transcendence of conceptual mind versus non-conceptual mind. The fourth stage of non-dual is the transcendence of mind versus no mind. No mind indicates the cessation of consciousness. As discussed in some previous sections, major periods of history, in terms of the developmental process, are divided into 3 tiers. From third tier, there are some correlations between the levels of worldviews and the states of consciousness. As already discussed, there are 4 stages of non-dual state. These 4 stages are related to the 4 stages of transcendent worldviews. On the transcendent level 1, we can intentionally experience the first stage of non-dual state. That is the integration of the physical body and effortless mind. It brings about the experience of flow. On the transcendent level 2, we can intentionally experience the second stage of non-dual state. That is the integration of the concept of existence and that of non-existence. On the transcendent level 3, we can intentionally experience the third stage of non-dual state. That is the integration of conceptual mind and non-conceptual mind. On the transcendent level 4, we can intentionally experience the fourth stage of non-dual state. That is the integration of mind and no mind. No mind indicates the cessation of consciousness. As discussed, from third tier, there are some correlations between developmental levels of worldviews and states of consciousness. On the other hand, in first tier and second tier, levels and states are relatively independent. That is, even in first tier and second tier, some people can experience higher states of consciousness, intentionally and stably. However, higher states of consciousness are experienced differently at each level of cognitive development. For example, on the traditional mythic level, people tend to have the cognitive ability of concrete logic, and it tends to interpret the experience of higher states of consciousness in a mythical way. It tends to see the vision of a higher being, as personified God. That is, on the traditional mythic level, the contents of the Bible, for example, tend to be interpreted literally, not metaphorically. Unlike the traditional mythic level, on the modern rational level, for example, people tend to have the cognitive ability of abstract logic. It can observe the experience of higher states of consciousness in a scientific way. In other words, it can interpret the contents of the Bible metaphorically, not literally. That is the difference between concrete logic and abstract logic.
Note:
Cognitive abilities are needed for the development of worldviews as well as morality. For example, in order to have higher levels of morality, we need to consider many different factors in reality, and for this consideration, higher levels of cognitive abilities are required. On the other hand, morality is not essential for the development of cognitive abilities. Because of this, some people with higher levels of cognitive abilities do not have higher levels of morality, such as intellectual psychopaths. In this way, an individual person can be very advanced in some developmental abilities, while being rudimentary in other developmental abilities. In the next chapter, we will mainly focus on cognitive functions,